Welcome back to the International Marxist University. I'm Alessio from Italy. This is the third day of our event. It is being watched from thousands of people around the world. And it is great to see your pictures on social media. So keep them coming in. And remember the hashtag IMU22. If you're wondering why I'm pausing, that's because this meeting is being translated in several languages. And so that's to give time to the translators. This session is dedicated to the Spanish conquest of the Americas. That is usually described by official history as a mission of the civilization. But it definitely was not the case. That's why we call the session Blood and Gold. The session will be introduced by Jorge Martin, who is a member of the International Secretariat of the IMT. And author of the many and wide analysis on Latin America. But before we start, I have a very good news for you. If you were connected last Saturday, you will know that we are collecting donations with a target to have our own international office in London. And Comrade just told me that we are now getting close to 800,000 euro of donation. Which is a fantastic figure. So I'm sure if comrades continue this way, we'll have a fantastic international office. Everyone can still donate at donate.marxist.com. Now, with no further ado, I call for Jorge to open this session.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, comrades, whichever time zone you're in. And welcome to this discussion. Now, the Spanish conquest of the Americas took place over 500 years ago. And therefore, one will think that this is just an historical event, purely historical event that can be analyzed from a certain distance. But this is not the case. Just a few months ago, the Peruvian Nobel Prize winner Vargas Llosa who is, in my opinion, a very good writer and also an extremely reactionary political figure, said the following: America was a tower of Babel of many languages. He was talking before the Spanish conquest. And he added, and as a result, the Indians killed each other. The Spaniards came to solve that. This is the total sum of wisdom from this Nobel Prize winner. But this is not just an isolated case. The whole of the Spanish official historiography about the conquest talks of a meeting of civilisations, talks about the Spanish conquistadors bringing culture to the savage natives. Talks about the Spanish conquistadors peacefully evangelizing the Indians into the Christian faith. And furthermore, we are told this task was carried out by a small band of courageous men against all odds. And to be frank, comrades, this is all rubbish from start to finish. In fact, the Spanish conquest of the Americas was not a meeting of civilizations. But a bloody affair in which the conquistadors used the most brutal methods of terror to impose their will. It was not driven by the interest of bringing culture, but rather it was driven by the thirst for gold, the search for the loot, and led to the wholesale destruction of indigenous cultures, which had flourished before the conquest, and in some cases reached very high levels of development. So in order to understand, we need to adopt a materialist approach to this historical event. And in the course of this discussion, we will try to answer the following questions. What were the different cultures and peoples which existed in the American continent before the Spanish conquest? What was Spain from a social, economic, and political point of view in the 15th and 16th centuries? What was the driving force behind the conquest of the America? and which were the consequences. If we start with the situation of America prior to the Spanish conquest, we need to discuss which were the different peoples which existed at that time. And we have to say that the answer is that there were a very large amount of different peoples which were at very different stages of development. A number of them were hunter-gatherer societies. At a very primitive level of development. There were also a number of other societies which had mastered agriculture and become sedentary. Amongst these, for instance, were the Taínos who lived in the Caribbean islands. And in reality, you can say that the Taínos lived in what we describe as Marxist as primitive communism. There was no private property. An Italian geographer, Pietro Martire, described them in the following way. It is proven that amongst them, the land belongs to everybody, just as does the sun or the water. They know no difference between meum and tuum, sorry. That is the Latin words for mine and yours. That source of all evils, he says. It is indeed a golden age. Neither ditches, nor hedges, nor walls to enclose their domains. They live in gardens open to all, without laws and without judges. Their conduct is naturally equitable. And whoever injures his neighbor is considered a criminal and an outlaw. That doesn't sound like a bad idea as to how to organize society. And it was really striking for the conquistadors and the people who came along with them to see this type of society and how it was organized. And then they proceeded to destroy them. But there were also a number of other peoples in the Americas which had developed more complex societies. Societies with a more developed division of labor. With social stratification and hierarchy. And which they already had a state structure. As we know, agriculture and urban societies emerged independently in different parts of the world. And amongst them, there were at least two sites for the independent development of agriculture and urban societies in the American continent. And one of them was in the north of what today is Peru, with a civilization which is known as the Norte Chico. And the other one was in Mesoamerica with the Olmecs. In fact, if you look at it from the point of view of historical materialism, what is striking is the way in which very similar processes took place independently from each other in different parts of the world. And this was the case in the American continent, which after its initial wave of population, and there's a lot of discussion about when that took place. There's different datings, and it's been by recent discoveries, it's been thrown back, the time at which Americas were populated initially. But what is clear is that human groups in the American continent were largely cut off from contact with any other human groups in other parts of the world. And they developed autonomously. And what I'm trying to say is that it's very striking, it's very interesting to see that they in fact developed more or less along the same lines as other human societies in other parts of the world with which they were not in contact. Amongst the peoples who had developed a more complex type of society were also the Chibcha in what is today Colombia. And they had a developed social structure, and they were very good at working with gold for ornamental purposes. But perhaps one of the greatest civilizations in the American continent were the Mayas. They developed in Central America. But by the time of the Spanish conquest, this civilization had already gone beyond its peak. For reasons that we don't really fully understand yet. The Mayans, independently of anyone else, had developed a complex system of writing. They had a very advanced system of astronomical observations. And they had a calendar, a very complicated calendar based on 3 different counts. Which was more precise than the calendars that were used in Europe at the same time. Then there were the Mexicas, or also known as the Aztecs in what today is Mexico. And the Incas in South America. And these were the 2 main civilizations that the Spanish conquistadors encountered when they arrived in the continent. Both the Inca and the Mexica societies had a number of points in common. And their mode of production, the way they produced goods and sustenance, was very similar. And this mode of production was based at the bottom on the common ownership of the land by the community. This common ownership of the land was known as the Ayllu amongst the Incas. The Ayllu was the name of the land that was in common, and the group of people that worked and lived on that land. And amongst the Mexicas, it was known as the Calpulli. And above this local community rose a state structure. And the state extracted surplus from the community in the form of tribute. And this tribute was then used to carry out public works which were useful for the local community, but which required an amount of labor that no single one of these communities could have carried out on their own. These public works were, for instance, irrigation works, the building of canals, aqueducts, the control of the flow of water in lakes and so on. Also, the building of a road system which allowed for the exchange of goods between the different local communities. In some cases, the state was also responsible for the storage of food which allowed them to withstand periods of crop failures and so on. And this was particularly important amongst the Incas, because their society was built on the shores of the Pacific Ocean. Which is affected by regularly occurring meteorological phenomena, El Niño, which provokes crop failure, periods of drought, and so on. So you see that the tribute that the communities pay to the state was useful for the communities, but also there was another side to this. Because of course, part of the tribute was also used by the priest caste and the ruling caste at the top of the state. For luxury consumption and for the building of religious and monumental works. And some of them were really very striking and probably played a role in establishing in ideology the domination of that ruling caste over the people. This mode of production had many similarities with what Marx and Engels call the Asiatic mode of production. However, I think that we must be careful in using this category. Marx always had a very serious scientific approach to the study of social phenomena. And he spent decades in the reading room at the British Library, not far from here. Analyzing in detail the capitalist mode of production. And that he considered his main life's work. But instead, he never fully analyzed the Asiatic mode of production. And he referred to it only in passing in a couple of places. As a hypothesis, which he never fully developed. And at the time when Marx was writing, the knowledge that existed of, say, for instance, Indian society was very basic. And the knowledge that existed about societies in Peru and ancient societies in Peru and Mexico was even less. But there are a number of things that we can say without any doubt. These two societies were complex and developed. They had a state structure. But they were not feudal societies in any way. Under feudalism, the individual peasant pays tribute to the individual lord, and the individual lord is the owner of the land. These societies also were not based on slavery, where the individual slave owner is the owner of many slaves. And these many slaves work the land that is of his own, of his ownership. In these societies, instead, the main production unit was the agricultural-based commune. There was no private property of the land. And the commune paid tribute not to an individual lord, but to the state as a whole. I won't be able to give a full detailed analysis of each one of these civilizations, but let's look for a minute to the Inca. The Inca civilization was known as the Tahuantinsuyu. Which meant the four corners. And rose up in the 13th century. And it was based, or is built on, the basis of previous societies which existed in the same region. Particularly the Tiwanaku and the Wari. From 1438, that is approximately 100 years or so before contact with the Spanish conquistadors, the Inca started the very impressive territorial expansion under the Inca Pachacuti. And at its peak, this empire or civilization, however you want to call it, reached 3,000 square kilometers. It was going from Colombia, what is today Colombia, all the way down to Chile and Argentina. And it was going in the east from, it was going from the edge of the Amazonian jungle to all the way to the Pacific coast. And at its peak, it had about 12 million inhabitants, approximately. It's difficult to get precise figures, obviously. Some historians have argued that this was the largest empire at the time, i.e. the one that had the largest extension of land from one end to another.
30 minutes gone, Jordan.
And as you can see, the geographic conditions were very peculiar, and they shaped the way they developed their economy. So this is a civilization that was based on the Andean mountains, very high peaks. These very high peaks are very close to the Pacific coast. Which is extremely dry. For instance, one of the driest places on Earth is the Atacama Desert. The humid winds that were coming from the Amazonian jungle would hit these very high mountains and release the water on the other side. And therefore, they had to have very, they developed a very complex forms of agriculture. Which was based, which was based on terracing along the side of these very high Andean mountains in order to create cultivation land. They developed very complex irrigation systems. Which captured the water from the snow in the Andean peaks and distributed it in the lowland valleys. They also used fertilizers, including guano, for instance, which then became a major export product later on. They developed genetic engineering, which allowed them to develop an enormous variety of strands of different plants that they were using, particularly the potatoes. Which were adapted to being cultivated, being grown at different levels of altitude, at different degrees of sun cover and temperature, and so on. They also very skillfully used the many very different ecosystems that their society was based on. And exchanging products between one and the other. And they had also developed methods for preserving the food all year round. By, for instance, freezing the potatoes. Drying the meat by a process called charqui. From which the word jerk meat comes from. They had also domesticated the llama and the alpaca. Which were the only two large animals that existed in the region. And they use them both for meat and for wool. And also for transportation. These animals were very well adapted to mountain roads and passages. But they had the amount that you could load on these animals was not so big. And because of the nature of mountain roads, you couldn't attach a cart to the animal. And because of the very narrow terraces where the agriculture was developed, you couldn't use these animals for traction for agriculture. They also had very impressive monumental architecture. And also an elaborate system of roads that covered the whole empire. They worked gold and silver for ornamental purposes to very high level of skill. They had advanced agriculture, they had advanced pottery. And they were very skilled in cloth making, which greatly impressed the Spanish conquistadors. The Ayllus, the agrarian community, paid tribute in labor and in kind. The labor tribute was called the mita. And every Ayllu had to provide certain number of people for a certain number of months to work for the state. And while they were away, the rest of the community tended to the parcel of the communal land and provided them with food and sustenance. The Inca society was characterized by a very strict organization of labor and division of society. Everything was accounted for. And this was shown in the fact that although they did not develop a proper writing system, they had a system for recording for recording the tributes, for recording the number of people in each Ayllu, for recording everything. Which was called the quipu and was based on strings in which a number of knots were made. This is a unique system which has to this day not been fully deciphered. The Mexica, on the other hand, which are also known as the Aztecs, and their society is sometimes called the Aztec Empire. I'm not going to go into this discussion. It's quite complicated, and I can't say I fully understand it myself. But basically, these were the people that had migrated from the north down to the Central Valley of Mexico. But when they arrived at the Central Valley of Mexico, this was already populated by other societies that had taken up most of the available land. So in 1325, the Mexicas built their capital, Tenochtitlan, in the middle of Lake Texcoco, by recovering land from it, by building platforms on which they build their city. Like the Incas, the Mexicas built on previous developments of other societies that had existed in the region. In this case, for instance, the Teotihuacan and the Olmec civilizations. Because they were hemmed in amongst all these other peoples that had already established themselves before, the Mexicas were a warrior people. And progressively, over a period of time, they managed to subjugate their neighbors and establish their own civilization as the dominant one. By 1427, they established like a tripartite alliance, a three-city alliance. Together with Texcoco and Tlacopan. And this three-city alliance reached the peak of its development in 1519, the peak of its geographic expansion. In 1519, the year in which Cortés landed in the Yucatan Peninsula. In fact, by this time, what had originally been an alliance of three cities on equal footing was already completely dominated by Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Mexicas. The Mexicas based their agriculture on the chinampa, which were floating platforms on the lake. Which had been built by piling up soil on the freshwater lake. And these were extremely fertile, giving up to 7 crops a year. And in order to maintain this system, they created a system of dikes, ditches, causeways, which regulated the level of water in the lakes. And also ensured the clear separation between fresh water and salt water, which existed in some of the lakes. These highly productive chinampas allowed for the rapid expansion of Tenochtitlan. And although there is a huge discrepancy between different historians about the population of Tenochtitlan at its peak, by 1519, this was a huge city which had between 80,000 or perhaps up to 300,000 inhabitants. And this was clearly larger than any city in Spain. And it could only be compared to the largest European cities of the time, like Paris, which had about 225,000. Or Naples, which had 125,000. The agriculture of the Mexicas was based on maize, sweet potato, cotton, chili peppers, pumpkins, beans. And they also had domesticated the turkey. Unlike the Incas, which had an economy that was completely dominated by the state, the Mexicas had developed a system of long-distance commerce. Which was carried out by a dedicated class of traders, the Pochtecas. The territorial expansion of the Mexica Empire was very fast. And was based on the imposing of tribute on the subjugated peoples. Some of these, if they had been defeated in battle, had rulers imposed by the Mexica. But others were allowed to keep their own rulers as long as they paid tribute. It has to be mentioned that the American civilizations faced a number of constraints. The main one was the lack of large domesticable animals which could be used for transportation or traction for agriculture. For instance, the Mexicas had discovered the wheel. And they had many toys with wheels. But the wheel was not used for transportation because there were no animals amongst the Mexicas that could carry those carts. And while both societies had very advanced and intricate ornamental metallurgy, neither of them had developed iron smelting, and bronze was very sparsely used. In fact, by the time the Spanish conquistadors arrived, both societies, both the Incas and the Mexicas, seem to have reached the peak of their development. And they were riddled by internal contradictions. And the discontent of the most recently conquered peoples that were subjected to tribute. So what was Spain in the 15th and 16th century? Spain was the product of the general development of feudalism in Europe, but also had certain peculiar characteristics, features. The 14th century had seen a period of crisis in feudalism across Europe. Changes in weather, bad crops, the development of epidemics. And this led to generalized discontent and peasant revolts. In the 14th and 15th centuries. And this conflict was resolved with the emergence of absolute monarchies. Absolutist monarchies. And these absolute monarchies were balancing, you could say in a Bonapartist way, between the power of the cities and the power of the noblemen. And Spain was a clear example of this, and the Charles I, fifth of Germany. And at the same time of this crisis of feudalism, we see the emergence, the beginning of the emergence of a bourgeois class, mainly represented by merchant capitalism. This was also the case in Spain. Catalonia, which was part of the Aragon, the Crown of Aragon, dominated trade in the Mediterranean. And Spain exported large amounts of wool to Flanders. The unification of Spain had been carried out as a result of a centuries-long struggle against the Muslim rulers in the south. Which was only completed in 1492 with the conquest of Granada. This period of constant warfare, which lasted for centuries, created a large section of the population which were like traveling knights that were at the service of the king and being paid in the loot of what they could conquer. And they, the hidalgos, impoverished lower level noblemen, which were accustomed to fighting, became the backbone of the Spanish conquest of America. It's also important to realize that this war against the Moorish kingdoms in the south had been conducted under the official banner of Christendom. Which played a key role also in the ideology of the Spanish conquest of the Americas. But we need to ask ourselves, what was the motivation in Columbus's voyage, which made contact for the first time with the Caribbean islands? What he was looking for, he was searching for a route towards China and India, a route for commerce through the east. So sorry, a route through the west to the east. That's my geography. And this was because the direct land route had been blocked by the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So whatever the official reasons and justifications given afterwards, the whole enterprise was motivated by commercial interest. The voyages themselves were funded by commercial capitalists. And above all, they were searching for gold. And here's a quote from Engels that explains this process in a brilliant way, I think. He says, how deeply the foundations of feudality had been weakened and its structure corroded by money around the end of the 15th century is strikingly evident in the lust for gold which possessed Western Europe at this time. It was gold that the Portuguese sought on the African coast, in India, and in the whole Far East. Gold was the magic word which lured the Spaniards over the ocean to America.
60 minutes, Jorge.
Gold was the first thing that the whites asked for when they set foot on a newly discovered coast. And Engels then explains, what's the meaning of this? But this compulsion to embark on distant adventures in search for gold however feudal were the forms which it took at first, was nonetheless basically incompatible with feudalism, the foundation of which was agriculture, and the conquests of which were directed at the acquisition of land. To this must be added that shipping was definitely a bourgeois business, so what Engels is trying to say is that the form the conquest took was feudal, but the content was in reality capitalist, in this case merchant capitalist. Also, we have to say that the conquest of America was only made possible by a whole series of technological developments which existed at the time, which had very little to do with Spain itself. Amongst these were the astrolabe, which allowed for astronomical observations at sea, the compass, gunpowder, which made possible early primitive firearms like cannons and arquebuses that the Spaniards used, it was also made possible by the development of sea-going boats, mainly the caravel, and then later on the nao, which was much bigger. The caravel was a relatively small but highly maneuverable boat which had been developed in the fight against pirates in the Mediterranean. And had been used first by the Portuguese in the early exploration and expoliation of Africa and some of the Atlantic islands. Very importantly, the caravels were able to sail windward, that is, navigate windward, that is against the wind. And also the Portuguese sailors and explorers had perfected the knowledge of oceanic currents, which made possible the crossing of the Atlantic. Of course, all of this knowledge concentrated in the Spanish crown. And the Spaniards also added, for instance, the steel sword, which they had perfected over centuries of warfare. Spain, therefore, at the time of the conquest, was highly contradictory. It was a feudal country, a reactionary monarchy, which was to embark which was to be the main force of the counter-reformation in Europe. Dominated by Catholic obscurantism and the institution of the Inquisition. But at the same time, a nation that was propelled onto this Atlantic voyage of discovery by the powerful impulse of merchant capitalism. The conquest itself was a brutal, bloody affair. Which started with enslavement of the local population of the Taino Indians in the Caribbean islands by extremely brutal methods. The Tainos rebelled and resisted, but they were massacred. If anyone wants to know the details, you can read the description that Bartolomé de las Casas makes in his a short account of the destruction of the Indies. He was a Spanish priest which participated in the conquest and then became a defender of the rights of the Indian populations. The Spanish conquistadors used terror as a weapon to dominate these populations. By cutting off people's noses, ears, hands, and other limbs. Burning them at the stake. Using specially trained mastiff dogs to set them on the local population. If you want to call this a meeting of civilizations, go ahead, but it was not. The intolerable conditions which the Taino Indians were subjected to by the Spanish conquistadors in the mines led to a massive amount of deaths and the practical extermination of the population in this whole region. Many of the Taino Indians committed suicide or had deliberate miscarriages. They did not want to live in that way. And the massive extermination of the local population in the Caribbean had two effects. One was the introduction of slavery, because they needed labor power to work in the plantations and in the mines. And the other was the push towards looting other territories in the north, towards the west, in the south. And this is what led to the conquest of Mexico. And the question has been posed by historians and official ideologists. Of how was it possible for a small number of Spaniards, 400 at the beginning that went with Cortés, and 1,100 at the peak of the campaign, to conquer and subjugate the Mexicas, which was a highly developed civilization, skilled in warfare. And this, furthermore, was accomplished in a relatively short campaign. Between February 1519 and August 1521. And the key factor here was that it wasn't really 400 Spanish conquistadors that carried out this feat. But that the Spaniards, led by Hernán Cortés, were very skilled in using the internal contradictions which already existed in the Mexica Empire. At every single step, they met one people, for instance, the Totonacas, right at the beginning. They promised them help in freeing themselves from tribute to the Mexicas. But at the same time, Cortés was telling the Mexica ambassadors that Cortés was on the Mexicas' side. And in this way, they managed to get local allies to fight these big battles together with them. For instance, when Cortés defeated the Tlaxcaltecas in a couple of battles, he did so together with hundreds of Totonac fighters. But this still leaves one question to answer. Why would any of these local peoples choose to ally themselves with this small number of foreign people that had just arrived? First of all, the Spaniards used the element of surprise. The local peoples had never seen horses or dogs used in warfare. They had never seen dogs or horses, and never mind being used in warfare. They had never experienced firearms, which the Spaniards had, although in small number. The Spanish steel swords and lances also gave them an advantage. And this was particularly the case because of the different fighting techniques, the different ways in which the different peoples made war. The different peoples that the Spaniards met in what is today Mexico, the form of warfare was mainly hand-to-hand combat, by individual warriors with the aim of taking prisoners, which will then be sacrificed. But the aim of the Spaniards was completely different. They didn't want to take prisoners. They wanted to kill as many as possible in order to instill terror and win the battle. And this was better done from atop a horse with a long steel sword or a lance. Even so, the superiority in weaponry or types of warfare doesn't explain the full story. Because some of the Spanish weaponry was not very appropriate for the conditions in America. Gunpowder will get wet in the humid conditions, was also in short supply. The arquebus was a very cumbersome early form of firearm. It had to be reloaded every single time. It could only fire once every minute or 2 minutes. Even the steel armor plates that the Spaniards used at the beginning were not adequate for the very hot and humid climate of the Americas that they encountered. In fact, very quickly, the Spaniards replaced the armor, the steel armor, largely by for the local version of armor, which was different layers of cotton woven together. So in reality, this factor, the technological superiority, had to be combined with other factors. On its own wouldn't explain the results. And the other factor is precisely this, the alliances with local peoples who were already at odds with the Mexicas. Therefore, the internal contradictions of the Mexica Empire played a key role in all of this. And in order to solidify these alliances, Cortés used methods of terror. For instance, the massacre of Cholula early on in the campaign.
80 minutes gone.
At this time, Cortés had already allied himself with Tlaxcaltecas. And he carried out a brutal massacre in Cholula, in which thousands died in the space of in a massacre that lasted for 2 days. And this helped solidify the alliance with the Tlaxcaltecas. And also sent a very clear message to the Mexicas of what the Spaniards were capable of doing. The question of the quality of the leadership also enters into the equation. Cortés was a cunning, skilled politician and a maneuverer, which was driven, very powerfully driven by the thirst for the loot. While Moctezuma, on the other hand, seems to have been indecisive at crucial moments of the campaign. And this indecisiveness probably reflects the internal contradictions which already existed in the Mexica society. Finally, it's important to mention the role of disease in the Spanish conquest. The Spaniards brought a whole series of infectious diseases which were unknown in America, including smallpox and measles. Because they were unknown in America, the mortality rate of these epidemics was very high, 80 or 90% perhaps. And this was to play a crucial role, for instance, in the conquest of Peru. When the Spaniards arrived in 1532, led by Pizarro, an illiterate, particularly brutal conquistador, with forces that numbered only 180, the epidemic had already arrived prior to the arrival of the conquistadors. And thousands were dying from a previously unknown disease for which there was no cure. And this had a powerful psychological impact, as you can imagine. Furthermore, when Pizarro arrived, this was in the middle of a civil war over the succession of Huayna Capac, the Inca ruler. And the two sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa, of Huayna Capac, were fighting in this civil war, dividing the whole empire in two warring camps. And Pizarro was again skillful in using what? In using treachery, terror, bloodletting in order to impose its will and capture Atahualpa, who had won the civil war against his brother. In the massacre of Cajamarca, he massacred 8,000 people who would come with Atahualpa unarmed into the town square. And as a result, captured Atahualpa. And this is another important point. The fact that these were hierarchical societies, both the Incas and the Mexicas, meant that once the Spaniards had captured the main leader, it was easier to control the whole structure. Ironically, other societies which were at a lower level of development, where there was no developed society, no state, no such developed hierarchy, these other societies were able to fight and resist the Spanish conquistadors for much longer. By using methods of guerrilla struggle and so on, like for instance, the Chichimecas and the Mapuche, the Chichimecas in Mexico and the Mapuche in Chile, which resisted for decades. The Mapuches. However, there was also resistance. This is not to say there was no resistance in other places. The Incas resisted very much. There was an early rebellion led by Manco Inca and Tupac Amaru. Which reestablished the Inca state based in Vilcabamba. Laid siege to the Spaniards. And it took them decades to defeat them. Up until 1572. So what were the consequences of the Spanish conquest of the Americas? First of all, a massive destruction of indigenous peoples and their cultures. The population of the Caribbean islands, as I already said, was almost practically completely exterminated. The population of the Aztec Empire, which at its peak was probably about 20 million. In less than 70 years had collapsed to 2 million. Through a combination of overwork, massacres, the impact of disease. The Spaniards systematically destroyed the temples of these cultures. Beautiful works of art, which were made in silver and gold, were melted down to be taken as loot. Perhaps one of the worst crimes of the Spanish conquistadors from a cultural point of view was the destruction of the Maya codices. beautiful books containing the history and literature. Hundreds of thousands died in hard labor in the silver and gold mines across the Spanish Empire.
90 minutes gone.
And this also led to the massive development of the slave trade. Millions of black people were captured in Africa and transported in inhuman conditions to be worked to death in the sugarcane and tobacco plantations. There's quite a lot of other things that I wanted to say, but my time's coming to an end. But there's two important consequences of the Spanish conquest that should at least be mentioned and can be developed in the discussion. One, the Spanish conquest and looting of the Americas was a key component part of the process of primitive accumulation of capital. And this is very well explained by Marx. But the second one is that, ironically, this did not benefit Spain in the long term. Yes, for at the beginning, Charles V was able to fund his wars in Europe and his empire with the gold and the loot from America. But at the same time, this meant that he was not obliged to make any concessions to the nation bourgeoisie, to the nation merchant capitalist class. It killed the potential development of capitalism in Spain before it had properly started. And therefore, it sealed the backwardness of Spain for centuries to come. Benefiting, on the other hand, those nations that had carried out bourgeois revolutions and were more they're more amenable to use these massive amounts of money for the development of capitalism. Our main task is to try to understand this process from the point of view of historical materialism. To brush to one side the political and ideological justifications and embellishment that the Spanish ruling class makes of this historic episode. And also to understand that the way in which the Spanish conquest took place had the impact of also sealing the backwardness of Latin America for many centuries to come. This is a vast subject. There are many more things that I could have said. But I hope that this introduction has whetted the comrades' appetite to learn more about it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to you, Jorge, for this very interesting and very rich introduction. Now we can open the debate. The first speaker will be Ubaldo Oropesa from the Mexican section of the IMT. Ubaldo will be speaking in Spanish. So if you are listening to the Spanish translation on Discord, you should switch to the main streaming. Okay, Ubaldo, you can go.
Sí, gracias. Gracias a Jordi por la introducción, que estuvo muy buena.
Thank you, Jordi, for that great introduction.
Dice Marx en el prólogo a la contribución de la economía política:
Marx said in his prologue to Critique of Political Economy,
al llegar a una fase determinada de desarrollo, las fuerzas productivas materiales de la sociedad entran en contradicción con las relaciones de producción existentes.
when societies reach a certain stage of development in the productive forces, they enter a contradiction with the existing relations of production.
Estas son las bases materiales para la revolución.
These are bases for revolution.
Más adelante dice:
He further adds,
ninguna formación social desaparece antes de que desarrolle todas las fuerzas productivas que caben dentro de ella, y jamás aparecen nuevas y más elevadas relaciones de producción antes de que las condiciones materiales para su existencia hayan madurado dentro de la propia sociedad antigua.
no social formation disappears before the productive forces that fit within it, and new or higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions had outgrown its previous society.
Estas dos frases son puntos fundamentales para entender todas las sociedades que han existido, incluidas las sociedades prehispánicas.
These two phrases are fundamental for the understanding of societies that have existed, including pre-Hispanic societies.
Antes de la llegada de los españoles a la que hoy se conoce como continente americano, existía una variedad de sociedades que se movían a diferentes ritmos de desarrollo.
Before the arrival of the Spanish to what is now known as the American continent, there was a variety of societies that moved at different paces of development.
Por ejemplo, existían tribus recolectoras que se regían por el matrilineado, particularmente en el sur de Chile. Y por el otro lado, existían grandes ciudades, estados, como la Mexica o la Inca, las cuales eran gobernadas por una burocracia muy dura, con familias que dirigían las ciudades, estados, de forma hereditaria.
For instance, there were matriarchal gatherer tribes, and on the other hand, there were big cities like the Mexica or Inca, which were ruled by a very hard bureaucracy with families that ruled the cities in a dynastical way.
Cada una de estas comunidades tenía una forma de dirección muy distinta. En las más pequeñas se alzaba la mano para votar en asambleas. La tierra era controlada por la comunidad o el calpulli.
Each of these communities had their own form of being run. The smallest would raise their hands to vote in an assembly, and the land was controlled by the community, calpulli.
Pero en las ciudades grandes hay castas dirigentes, familias señoriales, familias de guerreros y clérigos. La posesión de la tierra era comunal, pero la administración la desarrollaba el mismo Estado.
But in the larger towns, there were ruling castes, senior families of warriors and clergy. The possession of the land was communal, but it was administrated by the state.
Más rico de estas sociedades, de modo de producción asiático, se desarrollaban muy lentamente. En esta lentitud hay avances que hacen las diferencias entre ellas y son enormes.
Marx said that these societies with an Asiatic mode of production developed very slowly. And within this, you could find advances that were different between them, and they were huge.
El caso de Tenochtitlán es emblemático. La ciudad se fundó en 1324. Comienza como súbdita de otras ciudades. Eran utilizados como sicarios regionales. 200 años después era la ciudad más importante de toda la gran región.
The case of Tenochtitlan is emblematic. The town was founded in 1324, and it started being subjected to other cities. It was used as the assassin for the region. 200 years later, it was the most important city of this major region.
La producción se basaba en la producción de la tierra, en la explotación de la tierra y de las chinampas por medio del trabajo tributario, pero la fortaleza de esta sociedad no venía de ahí, del desarrollo de las fuerzas productivas, sino del conglomerado de fuerzas políticas y militares de la triple alianza que quien dirigía esta alianza eran los aztecas.
Production was based in production of the land and the exploitation of the chinampas, through which labor was tribute. But the strength of this society didn't come from there. It was the development of the productive forces and the strength of the political and military alliances, the Triple Alliance, which was led by the Aztecs.
La conformación de las ciudades-estado se da por la agrupación de pequeños pueblos que son sometidos por medio del tributo. La ciudad se convierte en el centro aglutinador político y económico, donde vivían en Tenochtitlán aproximadamente 700,000 personas sumando a su periferia.
The formation of these cities is through the aggregation of small towns that are subjected to tribute. The town turns into the center of political and economical accumulation, where almost 700,000 people lived, including its periferia.
La Triple Alianza dominaba cerca de 400 pueblos que van desde el centro de lo que hoy es México hasta Nicaragua. Para mantener este dominio se tuvo la necesidad de un ejército profesional, más burócratas y más recursos.
The Triple Alliance dominated 400 towns, which started on the middle of Mexico to what now is Nicaragua. To maintain this dominion, it was needed to have an army and also stronger bureaucrats and more resources.
Mientras más crecía y se extendía su poder político, se hacía más dependiente de los tributos. La ciudad solo producía un 25% de lo que consumía. Lo demás, es decir, un 75%, eran tributos impuestos a todo el mundo que estaba alrededor.
While the political power was growing, it was still dependent on tributes. The town was only capable of producing 25% of its consumption, and the rest, 75%, would come from tributes.
Es decir, había una contradicción insalvable, la imposibilidad de desarrollar las fuerzas productivas y la necesidad de un aparato militar y una burocracia más grande, tarde o temprano llegaría a manifestarse de forma violenta.
Which led to a huge contradiction, the impossibility of developing the productive forces and the necessity of a military apparatus and a larger bureaucracy, which sooner or later would manifest in a violent way.
Los tributos eran una carga muy pesada para los pueblos dominados y los sectores más bajos de la sociedad de Tenochtitlán. Esto fue ahondando las rivalidades y los odios entre los diferentes pueblos.
Tributes were a huge weight on the smaller towns and the smaller sectors of the society in Tenochtitlan. This started to strengthen the rivalry and hatred among towns.
Había un odio extendido hacia los aztecas porque su dominio era brutal. Todos los pueblos que eran sometidos se les respetaba su organización política. Aquellos que no eran sometidos eran dominados de manera directa.
There was a hatred towards the Aztecs. Those that respected their political structure were allowed to continue. Others were directly influenced by the Aztecs.
Este odio fue utilizado en el momento de la conquista por los españoles.
This hatred was then used by the Spanish during the conquest.
Basta decir que la falta de desarrollo de las fuerzas productivas comenzó a hacer mella en las relaciones sociales de la sociedad. Sin embargo, esta fue cortada por la conquista.
Needless to say, the slow development of the productive forces started to wither the social relationships among themselves, but this was even worsened by the conquest.
Podemos decir que no pudimos ver un desenlace de las contradicciones internas por la invasión.
we couldn't see the contradictions go forward because of the invasion.
Había en germen algunas otras formas de productivas nacientes, pero no con la suficiente fuerza para presentarse como una alternativa frente al modo de producción asiático.
There were other forces of production up and coming, but they weren't strong enough to present themselves as the true alternative to the Asiatic mode of production.
Había algunos esclavos que servían a las familias nobles, comenzaban a haber tierras privadas pertenecientes a la alta nobleza, pero ello no fue un modo predominante en la sociedad.
There were few slaves that served noble families, and there was private land among the nobles, but it wasn't very dominant.
El tributo no solamente era en especie, también era en trabajo. Los tributos, particularmente los que vivían alrededor de la ciudad, se pagaban sus tributos a partir de la siembra de las tierras de las clases gobernantes.
Tribute wasn't based just on products, it was also based on labor.
También se desarrolló un gran mercado donde se reunían más de 50,000 personas para intercambiar sus productos, pero tampoco era dominante en el intercambio libre de mercancías.
10 minutos.
There was also a large market where over 50,000 people would come together to exchange their products, but it wasn't dominant enough.
Habían algunos productos que eran utilizados como moneda, sin embargo, el dinero no era una circulación permanente ni regular.
Some products were used as currency, but money was not permanently circulating.
Especular qué hubiera pasado si los españoles no hubieran llegado es una tontería, pero podríamos decir que seguramente la sociedad hubiera entrado en contradicción y se hubieran extendido las posibilidades de otras sociedades, o esclavista o feudal.
To speculate what could have happened if the Spanish hadn't arrived is foolish, but we can be certain that society would have entered this contradiction and it would have extended to the possibilities of another society, like a slave society or the feudal system.
También existe la posibilidad de una implosión, donde la sociedad se pudo haber desgarrada en guerras civiles internas, como había sucedido tiempo atrás en otras sociedades como la teotihuacana.
There is also the possibility of explosion, where societies could have torn themselves apart through civil wars, like it had happened before in Teotihuacan.
En todo caso, vuelvo a repetir, la conquista lo que hizo fue cortar o redirigir estas contradicciones hacia otro punto.
So I repeat, what the conquest did was just to redirect all these contradictions.
Pero fueron utilizadas para acentuar la conquista de los españoles hacia las tierras latinoamericanas.
But these contradictions were also used by the Spanish to further their invasion into Latin American soil.
Por último, decir que estas sociedades no eran idílicas, como las quieren pintar algunos amorosos de los viejos malos tiempos. Eran sociedades basadas en la explotación por medio del tributo. Tenían una filosofía interesante y valiosa, pero eran sociedades cargadas de contradicciones.
Lastly, these societies were not idyllic, as postmodernists tried to paint them. They were societies based on the exploitation through tribute. They had a philosophy that was interesting and valuable, but it was heavy with contradictions.
No podemos estudiarlas con romanticismo, sino asumir sus múltiples contradicciones que tenían.
We can't study them with romanticism, but we must analyze them with their multiple contradictions.
El día de hoy hay corrientes en América Latina, particularmente la decolonial, que plantean que lo que existió antes de la llegada de los españoles era una sociedad idílica a la que tenemos que regresar.
Today in Latin America, you have the decolonized train of thought that pushes the narrative that society was idyllic before the arrival of the Spanish.
Pintan todo de una manera maravillosa, como color de rosa, como diciendo que en esas sociedades no había ningún tipo de contradicción ni explotación.
They portray everything as peaceful through rose-tinted glasses that deny the exploitation of the time.
Pero esto es falso.
But this is false.
No solamente, como bien lo dijo Jordi, La conquista se pudo dar por las contradicciones internas, por el choque de las culturas que hubo, sino también por una guerra intestina que había en los diferentes pueblos latinoamericanos desde hacía 600 años atrás.
Not only, like Jordi said, was this false, but there was only rivalry among the towns in the American continent that caused these contradictions to go forward.
Queda un minuto.
Eso es todo. Gracias.
That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ubaldo, for this contribution. Now we are having a brief 10 minutes break. But during the break, don't forget to keep posting on social media. Your pictures, whether you are watching from home or in a watching party. With the hashtag IamU22. See you in 10 minutes.
alive.
Welcome back to the IMU and to this session on Blood and Gold, the Spanish conquest of Americas.
Bienvenidos de regreso a esta sesión de la Universidad Marxista.
The first speaker after this brief break will be Carlos Che from the Mexican section.
Después de este receso va a ser Carlos Che de la sección mexicana.
Carlos will be speaking in Spanish. So if you are listening to the Spanish translation on Discord, you should switch to the main streaming.
Carlos va a estar hablando en español, así es que si están escuchando la traducción acá en el Discord, por favor cámbiense al Discord en vivo.
Vaya, Che.
La conquista española y en particular la caída de Tenochtitlan fue un punto de inflexión en la historia.
The Spanish conquest and particularly the fall of Tenochtitlan was inflection in history.
Los mexicas, a los que muchas veces se le llaman aztecas, eran la cultura más poderosa de Mesoamérica.
The Mexicas, which are commonly referred as the Aztecs, were the most powerful culture in Mesoamerica.
Con su conquista se aseguró el dominio de las culturas que antes eran dominadas por ellos.
When they were conquered, it was also assured the domain over the cultures that were formerly ruled by them.
Esto se sumó a los pactos con los pueblos que se aliaron con los españoles, llevando a estos a un enorme poder.
This was added to the pacts that were arranged with the peoples that allied with the Spaniards, giving them an enormous power.
Un punto de inflexión es un cambio fundamental en la situación que da un viraje brusco.
An inflection point is a fundamental change in the situation that means a sudden turn.
El proceso de conquista inició antes de la caída de Tenochtitlan y posterior a esta continuó un largo camino.
The process of the conquest began even before the fall of Tenochtitlan, and after it went a long road.
Pero este suceso significó un cambio fundamental.
But this happenstance meant a fundamental change.
Los efectos que esto traerían influirían en transformar el mundo.
The effect, the consequences of this could transform the world.
Este proceso dará un empuje que desarrolló el comercio a límites no vistos anteriormente.
This process could push development of commerce to limits not seen before.
De un importante impulso al capitalismo.
It gave an important push to capitalism.
Lo que movía a los conquistadores era la sed de oro.
The motivation of the conquistadors was the thirst for gold,
La búsqueda de riquezas.
the search for wealth.
Se encontraron riquezas, pero en un inicio no suficientemente rentables para cubrir las expediciones.
Wealth was found, but in the beginning, this was not profitable enough to pay for the expeditions.
Otros pueblos serían conquistados como los mayas, que ya no estaban en su periodo de esplendor.
Other people were conquered, such as the Mayans, that were no longer in their prime.
Los purépechas eran otro de los imperios mesoamericanos, además de los tlaxcaltecas, que no habían sido conquistados por los mexicas.
The Purépechas was another Mesoamerican empire that, like the Tlaxcaltecs, had not been conquered by the Mexicas.
Ellos no se habían aliado con los españoles para combatir a los mexicas.
They didn't ally with the Spaniards to fight against the Mexicas.
Los conquistadores y los purépechas llegaron a un acuerdo que aceptaba el dominio de los primeros a cambio de concesiones y el respeto de los gobernantes indígenas.
The first ones reached an agreement with the Spaniards so that they could exchange dominion so that the Indian rulers were respected.
Las contradicciones entre los conquistadores terminarían con esta alianza.
The contradictions amongst the conquistadors would finish this alliance.
Nuño de Guzmán mandó a asesinar al gobernante purépecha y con eso desarticuló a esta cultura.
Nuño de Guzmán managed the Purépecha ruler to be killed, and in this way he dismantled this culture.
Nuño de Guzmán reprimió a los purépechas y actuó de una forma más sanguinaria que Hernán Cortés.
Nuño de Guzmán repressed the Purépechas and was even more bloodthirsty than Hernán Cortés.
Si bien teníamos sociedades con cierto desarrollo, también había sociedades atrasadas.
There were some developed societies as well as some backward ones.
En la zona conocida como el Bajío y en el norte de América había culturas nómadas o seminómadas.
In the area known as El Bajío, as well as in the north of America, there were nomadic and semi-nomadic cultures.
Los mexicas les llamaban despectivamente chichimecas, que significa come perros.
The Mexicas would call them in a contemptuous way chichimecas, which means those who eat dogs.
Los conquistadores estaban tomando control de una nueva región a la que llamaron Nueva Galicia.
The conquistadors were seizing control of a new region called New Galicia.
Al ver el sometimiento que estaban generando los conquistadores, se comenzaron a ver rebeliones indígenas.
In the face of the dominion of the conquistadors, some indigenous rebellions would arise.
Entre los años 1532 y 1541, vimos la llamada Guerra del Mixtón.
Between 1532 and 1541, the War of Mixtón erupted.
Esta fue la más grande rebelión indígena en tiempos de la colonia, que puso en riesgo el dominio de la corona de Castilla en la región.
This was the greatest rebellion in the time that put the dominion of the crown of Castilla in the region at risk, at stake.
Los chichimecas no podían ser controlados fácilmente. Estos pobladores no daban tributos ni trabajaban para la corona de Castilla.
Chichimecas could not be brought down easily. These people paid no tribute, neither they worked for the crown of Castile.
Además, eran hostiles a los conquistadores y defendían con armas en mano sus fronteras.
They were also hostile towards the conquistadors, and they defended their territories arm in hand.
Tenían ritos y costumbres que escandalizaban a los ibéricos.
They had rites and customs that would astonish the Iberians.
Los conquistadores fueron avanzando sus dominios y explotando nuevos territorios.
The conquistadors advanced their dominion and explored new territories.
Primeramente, buscando tierras mejores para la ganadería.
First, they were looking for better lands for cattle raising.
También porque una de las tareas encomendadas por la corona era evangelizar a la población.
Also because one of the tasks given by the crown was to evangelize the locals.
Luego porque se descubrieron ricas minas de plata.
But then rich silver mines were discovered.
Había un ejército de sacerdotes.
There was a priest army.
Las misiones religiosas en algunos momentos contenían excesos de la violencia de los conquistadores.
At times, the priest would contain the excess by the conquistadors.
Incluso hubo sacerdotes que llegaron a simpatizar con ideas socialistas utópicas como Vasco de Quiroga en Michoacán o Bartolomé de las Casas.
Some priests could even sympathize with utopian socialist ideas like Vasco de Quiroga in Michoacán or Bartolomé de las Casas.
Pero la iglesia era ante todo una institución oscurantista.
But the church was above all a backwards institution.
Su papel fue extender el dominio imperial.
Its role was to extend imperial dominion.
Su función era terminar de someter y cooptar a los pueblos indígenas al nuevo régimen.
Their function was to finally submit and rule the indigenous people under the new regime.
Bueno, cuando los conquistadores descubrieron los yacimientos de plata,
When the conquistadors found about the silver mines,
dominar las zonas de los chichimecas se convirtió en una cuestión principal.
to domain the Chichimeca area became a prime necessity.
Había que dominar las zonas donde estaban las minas y también donde se transportaban las pues valiosas mercancías.
10 minutos.
The area where the mines were laid had to be dominated, as well as the transport of these commodities to be assured.
La guerra chichimeca pasa por varias fases, desde defensivas hasta intentos de exterminio físico.
The Chichimecan War goes through many phases. At first, defensive ones, and after that, to exterminate them.
La conquista de los chichimecas tardó alrededor de un siglo.
The conquest of the Chichimecas lasted for a century.
En las zonas donde se encontraban las culturas más desarrolladas, los conquistadores adoptaron viejas formas de explotación tributaria.
In the areas where more developed cultures were found, the conquistadors adopted the old tributary manners.
Se crearon las encomiendas, regiones donde los gobernantes tenían la función de proteger a la población y evangelizarla.
Encomiendas were created, and these were regions where the rulers had the function to protect the population and evangelize them.
A cambio recibían los tributos y saqueaban las riquezas.
In exchange, they got tribute and they got loot the wealth.
En las zonas donde se encontraban los pueblos menos avanzados y se encontraban las minas de plata, el desarrollo fue diferente.
It was very different in the areas where the less developed people were found and where the mines, the silver mines were found.
Primeramente se sometió a un sector de los indígenas a la esclavitud para trabajar en las minas.
First, some of the natives were submitted to slavery to work in the mines.
El trabajo forzado sumado a la devastación de la población por las epidemias obligó a buscar más manos para el trabajo.
The forced work, adding to the devastation of the population by the pandemics, forced the search for more hands for work.
Fue así que se trajeron esclavos provenientes de África para complementar la esclavitud indígena.
In this way, slaves coming from Africa were reached to complement the indigenous slavery.
El desarrollo de la técnica llevó a que fuera más rentable mantener trabajadores libres, pero que eran sometidos a brutal explotación.
The technical development made it more profitable to have free workers submitted to a brutal exploitation.
En un primer momento se mantuvo un trabajo remunerado para los trabajadores indígenas combinado con esclavitud africana.
In a first moment, there was the mine workers were paid salaries, but there were also African slaves in the mines.
Es interesante que en una de estas zonas donde se tuvo este desarrollo, en el Bajío, fue el epicentro de la futura revolución de independencia en México.
It is interesting to consider that in the area where this development was laid, El Bajío was the center of a future rebellion during the independence revolution in Mexico.
Que en 1810 se vivió una insurrección de masas.
A mass insurrection happened there in 1810.
Se calcula que entre los años 1503 y 1600 llegaron a España 153,000 kilogramos de oro y 7.4 millones de kilos de plata.
Okay,
It is believed that between 1503 and 1600, it arrived to Spain about 153,500 kilograms of gold and about 7.4 million kilograms of silver.
Lo que veíamos al otro lado del mundo era el desarrollo del comercio. Se llegó a América buscando nuevas rutas de comercio hacia la India y oro.
In the other side of the world, commerce was developing. America was reached looking for new routes for commerce, reaching the Indies and gold.
El comercio estaba limitado por los medios de intercambio. América dotó de la plata que impulsó al comercio mundial.
Commerce was limited by the lack of means of exchange. America gave a silver that could push forward world commerce.
El imperio español era en muchos sentidos medieval. Instauró una sociedad semifeudal en América.
Spanish Empire was in many ways medieval. It imposed a semi-feudal society in America.
Pese a su carácter, estaba sentando las bases de la destrucción del feudalismo.
It was setting down the basis for the destruction of feudalism, despite of its character.
El sometimiento basado en la sangre y brutalidad contra los pueblos indígenas llevó a un descomunal saqueo. Fue la base de la acumulación originaria capitalista.
Submission through blood and brutality against indigenous people brought a huge looting. It was the basis for the ordinary accumulation of capital.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very much. And the next speaker will be Kaspar Ortli from the Swiss section of the IMT.
Thank you, Alessio. I want to start my intervention with the question: what is a mode of production? And I hear myself. The starting point of our analysis of any society should always be the real empirical organization of human beings Do I have to do something?
We have a little problem with the Spanish translation.
Okay. Sure. The starting point should always be the empirical organization of human beings in how they produce their means of subsistence. And out of these facts, we abstract the essence and we generalize a mode of production. And in each stage of human development, we need to find what Marx calls the specific kind of production which predominates over the rest. For example, in feudalism, the essence is the exploitation of a surplus product from the peasants who work the land which belongs to a class of feudal lords, And the main means of production is the land. But after you have understood the essence of the feudal mode of production, you still don't understand how it was born and how in the end it gives rise to new class relations and a new mode of production. And it is true that there was very, very little development for the first 500 years or more. But then there was development in the late Middle Ages. And capitalist relations started to form in a 400-year process inside the feudal system. For example, the growing commerce led to the production for market, which we call commodity production. And this in turn revolutionized agriculture. The productivity of land rose. And this permitted the development of bigger cities and a higher division of work. And what is essential here is that feudalism did permit the development of the productive forces. Until these forces outlived the feudal relations of production. And the new class emerged that could replace these relations. So in Latin America, it's correct to call the Mexica society based on Asian mode of production. But that is still an abstraction that does not explain anything by itself. But it helps analyzing this society. Because we need to find the essence that explains the limits of the development of such a society. What was, as Marx calls it, the hidden basis of the entire social edifice? What Marx called the hidden basis of the entire social edifice. The Aztec society was an agricultural society. Land was also the main means of production. But as Jorge explained, it was commonly owned and commonly worked on by local communities called Galipuli. Who also elected their own leaders by themselves. And because there was no private property of the land, there were no classes in the strict sense. But what existed was exploitation of a surplus product. Through taxation by a state. who taxed these autonomous communes, the Galpuli. And the most developed peoples, the Mexicas, they stood at the top of the hierarchy. And they developed the state to exploit other peoples. And this led to the development of big cities and city-states with a huge state hierarchy and an apparatus. And in this state, the ruling families, they were not elected. But it was a hereditary ruling caste. Can I have how at the time, please?
It's 10 minutes now.
And with the rise of these societies, the division of work increased. They were artisans, for example, but they were employed by the ruling caste. They didn't sell on the market. But there existed also merchants and even instances of slavery. So we see how new relations develop, new techniques developed. And as Marx said, at a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production. But in the case of the Mexicas, no new class developed that could impose new relations of productions. Why not? Why not? What was the basis of the society, the one specific kind of production which predominates? It was the exploitation of the land in communal production. And this remained the key economic activity who had to sustain these huge cities. And in this main activity, there was no development of the means of production, or practically not. And this defined the sharp limits of the possibility of development. From when on, there were big contradictions inside this society developed. And this explains why the Mexicas needed to subdue even more communities. At the high point, they taxed more than 400 communities. And as Ubaldo explained, this increased the hatred by these communities against the Mexicas. And this level of hatred equalized the rising contradictions. It was just an expression of the rising contradictions. Which is essential to understand how the Spaniards winced against Mexico Tenochtitlan. So, as I said, to call the mode of production of the Mexicas part of an Asian mode of production does not by itself explain why they lost against the invaders.
14 minutes.
But it is an essential tool in the arsenal of Marxist analysis on how to find out how the societies work. But we shouldn't apply it in a static manner. As the same with feudalism, if you apply it in a static manner, you can't see why capitalism developed. We need to see the societies in a dynamic way, to see how the contradictions inside the societies developed over time. And as Ubaldo said, if they had lived 1,000 years more, who knows what would have happened. But they did not, and Marxism permits us to understand why they did not.
Time's over.
And by understanding the limits and the contradictions in this specific case of Asian mode of production, we can understand how it was possible for a lumpen pack of about 500 invaders to conquer a culture with at its high point had an army of 200,000 soldiers. Thank you.
Well, thank you to you, Caspar, very much for this contribution.
Muchas gracias a ti, Caspar, por eso.
Now, the next speaker will be David Ray from the Spanish section.
Hola, compañeros. En los últimos años, el régimen español, la derecha y lamentablemente también algunos en la izquierda, están resucitando el viejo argumento de que la conquista y esclavización de América fue una obra civilizadora. Y que en todo caso fue...
In the last year, the Spanish regime, the right, and some of the left has been resuscitating the old argument that the conquest and enslavement of America was a work of civilization.
Y que en todo caso fue menos brutal que las acciones del imperialismo británico o de Estados Unidos contra los nativos americanos.
And that in any case, it was better than what the British Empire did to Native Americans.
Los marxistas españoles estamos obligados a combatir esta falsa propaganda de autojustificación.
The Spanish Marxists have the duty to combat this false propaganda of self-righteousness.
Realmente la conquista tuvo un efecto doble. Fue decisiva para dar un impulso relevante al capitalismo naciente en Europa.
In reality, the conquest had double effects. It was a decisive time to give impulse to the birthing capitalism in Europe.
Pero tuvo efectos terribles en las poblaciones locales de América y en la propia sociedad española.
But it had terrible effects in the locals in America and for Spanish society itself.
Concretamente tuvo un efecto en conducir al naciente Estado español a un proceso de degeneración, declive, atraso y oscurantismo del que no se ha recuperado 500 años después.
Concretely, it conducted the young Spanish nation into a process of degeneration, decline, backwardness, of which it hasn't been able to recover 500 years later.
Hay que partir del hecho de que los embriones del capital manufacturero de Castilla que es la parte principal de lo que hoy conocemos como España,
We have to start from the embryonic capital of manufacturers in Castile, which is what we now know as most of Spain, and it was crushed.
fueron aplastados en lo que se llamó la revuelta de los comuneros en 1521,
It was crushed by what was called the revolt of the communards in 1521.
que en esencia fue una guerra civil entre los manufactureros de las ciudades de Castilla y los grandes ganaderos que exportaban lana a Flandes e Inglaterra y que tenían el apoyo de la nobleza y de la corona española.
In its essence, it was a civil war between the manufacturers of the cities in Castile and the big ranchers that exported wool to the Netherlands and England and had the support of the nobles and the crown.
Yendo al punto, los metales preciosos fueron canalizados desde España hacia el incipiente circuito económico capitalista europeo a través de dos formas principalmente.
The precious metals were channeled from Spain to the European economic circuit through two different ways.
En primer lugar, fueron utilizados para pagar los préstamos de los banqueros alemanes y genoveses que financiaban las guerras dinásticas de la corona española en Europa y el Mediterráneo.
Mainly, they were used to pay the loans to German and Genovese banks that were financing the wars between dynasties of the Spanish monarchy in Europe and the Mediterranean.
Y por otro lado fueron utilizados para pagar la importación de bienes manufacturados procedentes de Europa.
And to pay for the imports of manufactured goods in Europe.
La monarquía española tenía el derecho legal de apropiarse del 20% de los metales preciosos que llegaban de América.
The Spanish monarchy had the right to appropriate 20% of the precious metals that were extracted,
Aunque la cifra real superó el 30%.
even though the real numbers surpassed that of 30%.
Y muchas veces se apropiaba de parte del oro y de la plata de los particulares.
And many times they appropriated the silver and gold of commoners,
Y todo lo utilizaba para sus aventuras guerreras.
and everything was used in their adventurous wars.
Mientras que los ingresos anuales de Carlos V oscilaban en unos 2 millones de ducados, un ducado equivale actualmente a 167 euros,
While the annual income of Charles V oscillated between 2 million of ducados, one ducado equals to 167 euros.
llegó a acumular créditos, préstamos personales por valor de 39 millones de ducados.
He accumulated debt for 39 million ducados on personal loans.
Por ejemplo, solamente la campaña militar de 1536 sobre la Provenza, en la actual Francia,
The military campaign of 1536 over Provence in France
consumió los ingresos de la corona de 3 años.
consumed the income for the crown for 3 years.
Por ejemplo, mantener la flota mediterránea en la época de Felipe II, en la segunda mitad del siglo XVI,
For instance, to maintain the Mediterranean fleet during the times of Philip II
suponía 2,5 millones de ducados anuales.
needed 2.5 million ducados every year.
Y el coste del ejército de Flandes, en los Países Bajos,
And the price of the army for the Netherlands
entre 1571 y 1577 costó 11,7 millones de ducados.
between 1571 and 1577 costed 11.7 million ducados.
Esto equivale actualmente a 1.950 millones de euros.
Today, this would be 1,950 million euros.
Y cuando el oro y la plata no eran suficientes para estas aventuras guerreras, se saqueaban los presupuestos de los reinos, de la corona española y de las ciudades.
When silver and gold were not enough, the budgets for the different kingdoms that composed the Spanish crown would be sacked.
Y se imponía impuestos abusivos a los campesinos que eran conducidos al hambre.
Outrageous taxes would be put upon the peasants, which would lead them to hunger.
La sociedad española quedó arrasada en los siglos XV y XVI.
Spanish society was left barren between the 15th and 16th century.
Se abandonaron las obras públicas, las infraestructuras, el cuidado de los caminos.
Public works were neglected, same with infrastructure and roads,
Provocando el atraso interior y el aislamiento de las diferentes regiones y provincias que componían la corona española.
which led to the backwardness and isolation among the regions and provinces.
El otro medio a través del cual se canalizó el oro y la plata americana desde España hacia Europa fue con la importación masiva de productos manufacturados para América y para la propia España.
Another means through which gold and silver were channeled to America from Spain was with the import of products manufactured for America and for its own Spain.
Esto ya estaba preparado por el débil desarrollo manufacturero de Castilla, como ya explicamos.
This was prepared from the weak development of Castile, as we have previously explained.
Otro efecto destructivo fue la inflación, lo que se llamó en aquella época la revolución de los precios.
Another destructive effect was inflation, which was also called the rebellion of prices,
que alcanzó un 400% a lo largo del siglo XVI en España, el país que más sufrió la inflación en toda Europa.
which reached 400% throughout the 16th century in Spain, the worst country in Europe.
Esto encarecía la producción interior y terminó por destruir el débil tejido productivo.
This jeopardized internal production and finished the destruction of weak productive forces.
Mucha gente no sabe que España tiene el registro de más bancarrotas e impagos de la deuda pública que ninguna otra nación en la Tierra, 14.
Many people don't know that Spanish has the largest registration for bankruptcies and public debt than any other country in the world, being 14.
7 de ellas en los siglos centrales de la conquista americana, en los siglos XVI y XVII. Curiosamente, cuando más plata, más dinero llegaba a España.
7 of which took place during the main years of the American conquest, so between the 16th and 18th century, curiously the time when Spain was seeing the most income.
Mientras que la deuda que dejó Carlos V fue de 7,5 millones de ducados a mitad del siglo XVI,
While the debt that was left behind by Charles V was of 7.5 million ducados.
esta llegó a los 100 millones a principios del siglo XVII.
This one reached 100 million in 1601.
Con Felipe IV, entre 1621 y 1627,
With Philip IV between 1621 and 1627,
los genoveses se apropiaban del 76% de los metales preciosos que llegaban a España para cobrarse las deudas.
the Genovese appropriated 76% of the precious metals that reached Spain in order to seal the debts.
Esta era la España de los hidalgos empobrecidos con capas rotas, la España de la Inquisición, de las hogueras y de la decadencia general.
This was the Spain of impoverished gentlemen, of the Inquisition, of the stakes, and general decadence.
Marx describió este proceso en España como una putrefacción lenta y sin gloria.
Marx described this process in Spain as a slow putrefaction with no glory.
La burguesía española nunca pudo revertir esta situación por su atraso y su fusión con el viejo orden feudal.
The Spanish bourgeoisie could never revert the situation because of its backwardness and fusion with the old feudal regime.
Esta es la llamada España negra que pervive en nuestra monarquía, nuestro ejército, policía, jueces, en nuestra iglesia y en nuestros ricos oligarcas.
This is what's called Black Spain, that allows the monarchy, the military, the police, and the judges, and our church, our rich oligarchs.
Pero las fuerzas luminosas del Estado español también existen y son más fuertes que nunca.
But the luminous forces of the Spanish nation are stronger than ever.
Solo la clase obrera está en disposición de terminar con este legado de atraso y oscuridad.
It's only the working class that has the means to finish this legacy of backwardness and obscurity.
Lo ha intentado incontables veces con enorme heroísmo, sacrificio y mártires, y lo va a seguir intentando. No hay la menor duda sobre eso.
They have tried so many times with enormous heroism, sacrifice, and martyrs, and they will keep trying. There's no doubt about that.
Nuestros hermanos y hermanas de los pueblos originarios de América reclaman que España debe saldar la deuda de siglos de saqueo y genocidio.
Our brothers and sisters of the towns in America claim that Spain has to seal the debt of after centuries of looting and genocide.
La podrida
The rotten and reactionary Spanish
y
oligarchy.
ra-
The rotten and
pero la clase obrera
sorry.
sorry.
The rotten and reactionary Spanish oligarchy has shown that they're not going to do it.
Pero la clase obrera española sí lo hará. Tenemos apuntada la cuenta y la vamos a devolver.
But the Spanish working class will do it. We have written down a check and we will give it back.
No con oro,
Not with gold. Not with silver. But through socialist revolution that will shine brighter and stronger than all the precious metals in the world together.
iluminará el camino de la liberación de todos los oprimidos y explotados en América y en todo el mundo.
And that will light the path for liberation of the oppressed and exploited in America and the rest of the world.
Well, thank you very much, David. It was a great intervention.
Muchas gracias, David.
And now we have Nicolas Cueto from the Belgian section.
Ahora tenemos a Nicolás Cueto de la sección belga.
Okay, you're on.
Listo.
Buenos días, camaradas. Antes de abordar la sublevación general liderada por Túpac Amaru II en 1780 en el actual Perú,
Before dealing with the general uprising led by Túpac Amaru in 1780 in the territory of present-day Peru,
les voy a dar elementos de contexto.
I will give in some background information.
El objetivo de los españoles en las Américas fue extraer los metales preciosos como el oro o la plata por medio de la mita.
The aim of the Spaniards in the Americas was to extract precious metals such as gold and silver by the means of mita.
La mita era el trabajo forzoso que permitió al poder colonial colocar una séptima parte de la población indígena al trabajo en el sector privado como las minas, obrajes y haciendas.
The mita was the forced labor that allowed the colonial power to place 1 in every 7 indigenous people to work in the private sector of mines, textile, workshops, and farms.
El problema es que hubo una caída demográfica de aproximadamente un 80% en el territorio del Imperio Inca, consecuencia de la colonización, como lo explicó Jorge.
Problem is that there was a demographic drop of approximately 80% in the territory of the Inca Empire as the result of colonization, just like Jorge said.
En el siglo XVIII, la población era compuesta de 60% de indígenas campesinos.
In the 18th century, the population was composed by 80% by indigenous peasants, by 60% of indigenous peasants.
Es decir, que la mayoría de la población trabajaba en la agricultura en comunidades económicamente autónomas.
This means that most of the population worked in farming in autonomous settlements.
Para enriquecerse, la burguesía mercantilista de Lima necesitaba aumentar la mano de obra para poder extraer y exportar más oro.
To become richer, the merchant bourgeoisie of Lima needed to increase the labor force in order to extract and export more gold.
En la segunda mitad del siglo XVIII implementan reformas que van a ejercer una coerción económica para que los indígenas campesinos tengan que vender su excedente de producción.
In the second half of the 18th century, they implemented reforms that would exert economic coercion so that the indigenous peasants would have to sell their surplus production.
O vender su fuerza de trabajo en las minas, obrajes y haciendas.
Or sell their labor power in the mines, textile workshops and farms.
El pago en efectivo del tributo, esas reformas son el pago en efectivo del tributo y el reparto forzoso de mercancías a la población indígena.
These reforms were the payment of the tribute in cash and the forced distribution of goods to the indigenous population.
Los indígenas estaban obligados a aceptar y pagar las mercancías que traía el funcionario colonial.
The indigenous people were forced to accept and pay for the commodities brought by the colonial officials.
El aumento de la mano de obra permitió que las exportaciones e importaciones cuadruplican entre 1740 y 1780.
5 minutos.
The increase in the labor force allowed exports and imports to quadruple between 1740 and 1780.
Estas reformas se convirtieron en mecanismos de saqueos de las provincias a favor de la burguesía mercantil de Lima y de la corona.
These reforms became mechanisms for the plundering of the provinces in favor of the mercantile bourgeoisie of Lima and Spanish crown.
El descontento de los indígenas se extendió a otras capas de la sociedad como los curacas.
The discontent of the indigenous people spread to other layers of society, such as the curacas.
Administradores de las comunidades en el incanato,
Who were administrators of communities in the former Inca society.
las autoridades coloniales utilizaban los curacas como intermediarios entre ellos y las masas indígenas explotadas.
The colonial authorities used the curacas as intermediaries between themselves and the exploited indigenous masses.
Eran una élite indígena con un estilo de vida comparable a la burguesía rural.
They were an indigenous elite with a lifestyle comparable to that of the rural bourgeoisie.
En 1770, la última reforma de los repartos amenazaba las posesiones de los curacas.
In 1770, the last reform of the distribution threatened the possessions of the curacas.
En caso los campesinos no eran solventes, el funcionario que hacía los repartos podía cobrarse con los bienes del curaca.
If peasants were not solvent in some instance, the official who made the distribution could cash in on the curacas property.
José Gabriel Condorcanqui, que tomará el nombre de Túpac Amaru II durante la rebelión en 1780.
José Gabriel Condorcanqui, who took the name of Túpac Amaru II during the rebellion in 1780,
era un curaca en la provincia de Cusco.
was a curaca in the province of Cusco.
Cusco era una de las regiones más empobrecidas por los repartos debido al bajo rendimiento de sus tierras.
Cusco was one of the regions most impoverished by the distribution of commodities due to the low productivity of its farmlands.
En la escuela de curacas de Cusco, Túpac Amaru se familiarizó con la obra del Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, una interpretación utópica y embellecida del imperio Inca.
In the school of curacas of Cusco, Tupac Amaru became familiar with the work of the Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, a utopian and embellished interpretation of the Inca Empire.
Esta obra constituyó el elemento de unidad ideológica entre los curacas y los indígenas campesinos.
This work constituted the element of ideological unity between the curacas and the peasant indigenous people.
El empobrecimiento de las provincias, afectando primero a los indígenas campesinos y precarizando hasta los curacas.
The impoverishment of the province, affecting first the indigenous peasants and making even the curacas more precarious,
fue la base material de la alianza de clases de este movimiento.
Was the material basis of the alliance between the indigenous peasants and this movement.
La rebelión liderada por Tupac Amaru hizo temblar la corona española y la burguesía de Lima.
The rebellion led by Tupac Amaru shook the Spanish crown and the Lima bourgeoisie.
Después de su captura en 1781, fue descuartizado y toda su familia fue ejecutada, con excepción de su hijo menor.
After being held prisoner in 1781, he was dismembered and his entire family was executed, except for his youngest son.
La insurrección fue totalmente derrotada en 1783.
The insurrection was totally defeated in 1783.
La sublevación general tuvo un impacto sobre todas las colonias y fue un símbolo para todos los pueblos oprimidos de las Américas.
The general uprising had an impact on all of the colonies and was a symbol of all oppressed peoples in the Americas.
La revolución de 1780 plantea la cuestión indígena, campesina y fue un primer intento de resolverla.
The revolution of 1780 raises the peasant indigenous issues and was a first attempt to solve it.
Aun si Tupac Amaru y los indígenas campesinos hubiesen triunfado y aplicado el programa político de volver al incanato,
even if Tupac Amaru and the indigenous peasants had triumphed and implemented the political program of returning to the Incan Empire,
no se hubiera solucionado el problema de fondo de la cuestión nacional indígena.
The basic problem of the indigenous national issue would not have been solved.
Como lo dice el marxista peruano José Carlos Mariátegui sobre la cuestión,
as the Peruvian Marxist José Carlos Mariátegui says on this issue,
la solución no es la creación de un Estado burgués indígena, que tendría todas las contradicciones internas y externas que caracterizan el Estado burgués.
The solution is not the creation of an indigenous bourgeois state that would have all the internal and external contradictions that characterize the bourgeois state.
Como lo vemos en la actualidad, tampoco basta con crear un Estado plurinacional como en Ecuador y Bolivia.
As we can see in the present day, it is not enough to create a plurinational state as those in Ecuador and Bolivia.
Para resolver la cuestión indígena se necesita el programa del socialismo revolucionario.
To solve the indigenous issue, the program of revolutionary socialism is needed.
Concluyendo con una cita de Mariátegui,
finishing with a quote from Mariátegui,
la revolución latinoamericana será nada más y nada menos que una etapa, una fase de la revolución mundial.
The Latin American Revolution will be nothing more and nothing less than a phase of a world revolution.
Será simplemente y puramente una revolución socialista.
It
Muchas
will
gracias.
be simply and purely a socialist revolution. Thank you.
Thank you for this contribution, Nicolas. Now, the last speaker will be Adrián Alvarado from the Mexican section.
Sí, muchas gracias. A la llegada de los españoles a Mesoamérica, que es el territorio que hoy abarca la mitad de México y Centroamérica,
At the arrival of Spaniards to Mesoamerica, which is the territory and now half of Mexico and Central America.
Ya se habían desarrollado diversas civilizaciones. Entre las más relevantes encontramos a la cultura teotihuacana,
Many cultures, diverse cultures had already developed. Amongst the most relevant, we find the Teotihuacan culture,
que se desarrolló en el Valle de México.
Which developed in the Valley of Mexico.
La maya, que abarcó el sureste mexicano y parte de Centroamérica.
The Mayans that were located in Southeast Mexico and part of Central America.
Y la civilización mexica.
And the Mexicas civilization.
En 1521 en la región vivían cerca de 11 millones de personas.
In 1521, there lived 11 million people.
Población que México alcanzó posteriormente hasta el año de 1910.
A population that Mexico reached again afterwards in the year of 1910.
En el epicentro de la cultura mexica, la ciudad de México Tenochtitlan.
At the core of Mexica culture in the city of Mexico Tenochtitlan.
Habitaban cerca de 300,000 personas.
Inhabited about 300,000 people.
En esa época, en las principales ciudades europeas vivían cerca de 100,000 personas.
At the time, in the main European cities lived about 100,000 people.
Pero, ¿cómo comprender desde la perspectiva del materialismo histórico?
But how are we to understand under the perspective of historic materialism?
Las sociedades mesoamericanas y en particular a la civilización más desarrollada, la mexica.
The Mesoamerican societies and in particular the most developed one, the Mexica.
Las condiciones materiales de la zona impidieron el desarrollo de la economía basada en la ganadería.
The material conditions of the area didn't allow the development of an economy based on cattle raising.
Además, en Mesoamérica no existían animales de tiro o de carga.
Also, in Mesoamerica, there were known draft animals.
Y no conocieron aplicaciones para inventos como la rueda.
And they didn't know applications for such inventions as the wheel.
Y tecnologías que facilitaran la fundación del acero y sus diversas aplicaciones.
Nor technologies that could allow for the steel foundry and its diverse applications.
Entre los mexicas, la propiedad de la tierra pertenecía a la comunidad calpuli.
Amongst the Mexicas, the land ownership belonged to the community, which is called the calpuli.
Que era la unidad básica económica, militar, administrativa y educativa.
This was the basic economic, military, and educational and administrative unit.
Y también pertenecía al Estado.
It also belonged to the state.
Se ponía a disposición de los miembros para su explotación colectiva.
It was put at the disposal of its members for collective exploitation.
Pero esta no era heredable ni se podía vender.
But it could not be inherited nor could be sold.
El cultivo se realizaba mediante chinampas, que eran parcelas artificiales creadas sobre el lago.
The farming was brought through chinampas that were artificial land plots created above the lake.
Sobre el que fue construida Tenochtitlán.
The lake above which Tenochtitlan was built.
También crearon grandes canales de riego, presas, diques y depósitos pluviales.
They also created irrigation canals, dams, and rain deposits.
También los mayas explotaban la tierra de una manera colectiva.
The Mayans also exploited the land in a collective fashion.
Con la diferencia que establecieron un sistema sedentario de explotación.
With the difference that they established a sedentarian exploitation process.
Aquellos que trabajaban la tierra lo hacían de manera colectiva para su subsistencia.
Those who would work the land worked collectively in order to subsist.
Y para pagar tributo a cada jefe de la comunidad, calpulec.
and to pay a tribute for the leader of the community, the Calpulec.
Además, entre los estratos más bajos de la sociedad se encontraban los tamemes,
Also, in the lower layers of society, there were the tamemes,
cargadores de todo tipo de mercancías,
carriers of all sorts of commodities.
y algunos esclavos, tlatlacotin,
Some slaves or tlatlacotin,
quienes pagaban alguna deuda o habían sido juzgados por un delito.
who were paying some sort of debt or had been judged by some sort of crime.
Pero el trabajo esclavo no fue fundamental en la estructura económica.
But slave labor was not fundamental in the economic structure.
La propiedad privada existía con algunas excepciones para los gobernantes,
Private property existed as an exception for some of the rulers,
para los guerreros destacados en alguna batalla de relevancia
for outstanding warriors in a relevant battle,
y las que poseían los templos.
and the ones that were possessed by the priesthood.
Pero esta tierra no se podía heredar.
But this land was not to be inherited.
La nobleza tenía escuelas especiales para su educación, tribunales especiales para ser juzgados y también agrupaciones militares.
The nobility had special schools for their education, special tribunals to be judged, and military agrupations.
Entre ellos también existían grandes comerciantes, los pochtecas, que servían también como espías para el Estado.
There were also important merchants or pochtecas that served as spies for the state.
El Estado era centralizado y controlado por esta casta privilegiada.
The state was centralized and controlled by this privileged caste,
que glorificó la guerra con la finalidad de someter a otros pueblos y cobrarles un tributo.
which glorified war with the end to submit other people and get tribute for them.
El cual se realizaba mediante un encargado especial, calpixque,
This was made through a special manager or calpixe
en la zona conquistada.
in this conquered zone.
El tributo era un porcentaje de lo producido por los pueblos y era entregado para que éste se administrara
Tribute was a percentage of what was produced by the villages, and it was given to be administrated and transported by nobility.
y trasladarlo a la nobleza de México Tenochtitlan.
And it was given to the nobility of Mexico Tenochtitlan.
Además, el tributo sufragaba grandes obras de construcción y sostenía las campañas militares.
Through tribute, big construction works were paid for, and as well as military campaigns.
Esta práctica ha sido documentada por el Código Mendoza,
This practice was documented in the Mendoza Codex,
en el cual mediante dibujos y códigos
in which through drawings and codes,
comunicó la conquista de diversos pueblos por parte de los mexicas.
it was portrayed the conquest of many people on behalf of the Mexicas
Y los tributos que se les pagaba.
and the tributes that were paid to them.
Esta estructura de sometimiento en el Imperio Mexica facilitó la conquista de los españoles.
This submission structure in the Mexican Empire made it easy for the Spaniard conquistadors.
Existe una peculiaridad de las civilizaciones mesoamericanas.
There is a peculiarity in Mesoamerican civilizations.
Si definimos a una clase social como aquellos grandes grupos
If you are to define a social class as huge groups
que se diferencian entre sí por el lugar que ocupan en la producción social,
that are different from one another because of the place they have in social production,
por su relación con los medios de producción
for
Yes,
the
please.
relation to the productive means,
y por su papel en la organización social del trabajo,
and for their role in a social organizing of labor.
la nobleza, los sacerdotes, comerciantes y altos mandos militares entre las civilizaciones mesoamericanas,
Nobility, priests, merchants, and high ranks, military high ranks in the Mesoamerican civilizations
no eran propietarios de la tierra,
were not the owners of the land,
salvo algunas excepciones,
except for some exceptions,
pero en las cuales la tierra podía pasar nuevamente a propiedad del Estado,
in which land could again come to the hands of the state.
por lo que es más certero definirlos como una casta militar y sacerdotal.
So they are more accurately defined as a military and a priest caste.
Marx realizó una aproximación a este modo de producción que denominó asiático,
Marx defined this mode of production as Asian.
en sus escritos sobre las formaciones económicas precapitalistas,
In his writings about the pre-capitalist economic formations,
contenida en su recopilación de anotaciones
which are contained in his notebooks,
en los elementos fundamentales para la crítica de la economía política,
such as the fundamental elements for the critique of politic economics,
y en aquellos en los que analiza la dominación británica sobre la India.
and those in which he analyzes British dominance over India.
Como observamos, no fue una sociedad igualitaria, no la podemos idealizar.
As we can see, this was not an egalitarian society. It is not to be idealized,
Como algunos latinoamericanistas lo hacen.
like some Latin Americanists do.
Sin embargo, reconocemos que sobre esta base económica se levantaron las culturas mesoamericanas,
Nonetheless, we recognize it was on this economic basis that Mesoamerican cultures rised.
que aunque no alcanzaron a desarrollar una visión del mundo completamente racional,
Even though they didn't reach a completely rational worldview,
la casta privilegiada liberada del trabajo manual
the privileged caste free from hand labor
desarrolló avances importantes en el estudio del movimiento de los astros,
developed important advancements in the study of the movement of stars,
y por consecuencia una concepción correcta del tiempo.
and right conception of time as a consequence of this.
Los mayas conocían el número 0, su esencia y significado.
Mayans came to know the number 0 as much as its significance and essence,
Aunque su pensamiento aún estaba impregnado de mitos y concepciones mágicas.
even though their thought was still impregnated with myths and magical conceptions.
También surgieron grandes poetas y escritores.
They also had many great writers and poets.
Solo el estudio del materialismo histórico nos permitirá comprender
Only by studying historic materialism we will come to comprehend
a profundidad Mesoamérica y aquella civilización que ha sido su más grande expresión, los mexicas.
the depths of Mesoamerica and which came to be its greatest civilization, the Mexicas,
Y entender la expresión plasmada en uno de sus poemas.
and to understand the expression that was portrayed in one of their poems.
En tanto que permanezca el mundo,
As long as the world remains,
no acabará la fama y la gloria de México Tenochtitlan.
there will be no end for the fame and glory of Mexico Tenochtitlan.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian, for this wonderful intervention. Well, we had a really participated debate. we have still some time, and so I call Jorge Martin to sum up this discussion.
Okay, yeah, I thought. Sorry, we got a technical problem. I thought it was a very interesting discussion. Dealing with different aspects. The question of the Asiatic mode of production, which was dealt with by several of the comrades. And it was approached from a correct point of view. That is, historical materialism is not a series of abstract categories. That you can pick and choose from and then superimpose onto real living conditions. But rather, it's the opposite. In order to understand a given society or a given socio-economic formation, you have to analyze it in its internal functioning, its internal laws. And on the basis of this detailed study, try to draw out its main general features. And once you've done that, then abstract general categories can be useful in order to classify this each economic system. Whether it's a type of feudalism, or is a type of slave society, or is it or similar to the Asiatic mode of production. I think the intervention by David Rey was also very interesting. About the question of the impact of the conquest of America in determining the backwardness of Spain. And also in demolishing the myths which are still relevant today, which are part of the ideology of the ruling class in Spain. Also, Nicolas' intervention was very interesting, because he brought out the real economic and social basis of the uprising by Tupac Amaru at the end of the 18th century. And there's another interesting aspect of this, which is the way in which the Spanish conquistadors used some of the structures of the previous society for their own benefit. For instance, how the mita, the labor tribute under the Incas, was used in order to provide labor under the Spanish conquistadors for the silver mines in Potosí.
5 minutes.
But while the form was the same, the content of each changed a lot. It was no longer a form of tribute by the community to the state. It was more similar to a form of enslavement. And tens of thousands of indigenous people died in the mines in Potosí because of the extreme exploitation of the working conditions there. Also, that intervention brought out another aspect. Which is how the Spanish conquest of the Americas was not a one-sided process. There was enormous resistance. There were rebellions throughout the period. Another aspect of this, which has not been mentioned, is the creation of freed slave societies, the Maroons or the Cimarrones, in different parts of Latin America. At the end of the day, perhaps the most important aspect of the Spanish conquest of the Americas is precisely the creation of the world market after, which gave rise to capitalism. The Spaniards, after conquering America, continued and colonized the Philippines. Creating an enormous current of trade between China, America, and Europe. And of course, the role that the conquest of America played in the primitive accumulation of capital, which some comrades have mentioned. And I would like to give the last word to Marx, which describes the process in the following way. He said in Capital, the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signal the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings, and he is being ironic, of course, are the chief momenta of primitive accumulation. And as a conclusion, he said, capital comes into the world dripping from head to foot. From every pore with blood and dirt. And capitalism, nevertheless, played an enormously progressive role.
10 minutes.
From the point of view of the development of the productive forces. But this is no longer the case. And it is our task today to put an end to this rotten, violent, and evil system which increasingly condemns millions to poverty, starvation, and a life of exploitation which is not worthy of the name. And open the way for the socialist transformation of society, which will release the pent-up productive forces which can no longer fit in this rotten system. Thank you.
Well, comrades and listeners, well, I think that was really inspiring, this finish of the session. And I can imagine people applauding all over the world. We are finishing this session a few minutes late, but I think really it was worth it. And last thing I want to say is that if you agree with what you have listened to, and if you are not yet part of the international Marxist tendency, but want to fight for these ideas, well, so join us. And to do so, you can go to marxist.com/join. Then I just thanks again all the comrades who spoke in this session. And we now have a break until 5:30 p.m. British time. And then you can choose among 3 different sessions that are the permanent revolution in Europe in 1848, the revolutionary legacy of Rosa Luxemburg, and competition, monopoly, and planning, market versus socialism. Market versus socialism. El mercado contra el socialismo. So see you, everyone, there. Bye.